Hello, my name is Stephanie Zito, and I work with the National Deaf Center. I am an interpreter and C-print captionist. I'm also the current board president for the National Association of Interpreters in Education, or NAIE. Hello, my name is Kristen Gwines. My background is in teaching deaf and hard of hearing students. I'm a teacher of the deaf, and I am also the current publications director for the NAIE. Within the field, we have a long history of attempting to provide guidance and support for educational interpreters, but that history lacks consistent standards. In the 1980s, an educational interpreter task force was created who initially reviewed 13 different state-level handbooks. In 1989, that task force released a report based on their review and concluded that standards, minimum qualifications, roles, and other expectations varied widely. That problem continues today. The field of education is lacking standard guidelines for educational interpreters, which led to the recent establishment of the NAIE. In 2010, the University of Northern Colorado, or UNC, received a grant from the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Special Education Programs, OSEP. The purpose of that grant was to spend 5 years investigating and documenting the patterns of practices and standards among educational interpreters. During that investigation, the researchers found there was a gap in the interpreting field, which was the need for a national organization who could focus primarily on educational interpreters and the complexities of their roles and responsibilities, thus being able to support their work. In 2015, a steering committee was established who could lay the ground for the NAIE, including writing their bylaws, filing for nonprofit status, and other similar work. In 2016, the NAIE officially launched during its first national conference on interpreting in education. So how many deaf students are in mainstream settings? According to one study called the National Longitudinal Transition Study 2, or NLTS2, the data shows percentages of deaf students who experienced mainstream school, deaf school, or both. 78% were mainstreamed, 14% attended deaf schools, and 8% were involved in a combination of both. The percentage of students in mainstream settings who use interpreters was not specified. NAIE primarily focuses on mainstream settings and how students access the learning environment through interpreters. Our guidelines outline expectations, skills, qualifications, as well as roles and responsibilities. Today, we will expand on what's included in the guidelines and how you can apply the guidelines to working with educational interpreters. Let's begin with Section 1, Professional Standards. This section includes 4 distinct areas, the first of which is academic credentials. The required academic credentials include a 4-year degree inclusive of educational interpreting specific coursework and the completion of an internship in an educational setting. The second component is professional requirements, and these include passing the Educational Interpreter Performance Assessment, or EIPA, written examination, as well as obtaining a minimum score of 4.0 on the associated performance assessment. The third component, continuing education, refers to the responsibility of each educational interpreter to develop and maintain an appropriate professional development plan. Lastly, the final component is supervision and accountability. Examples of supervision and accountability include complying with local, state, and federal regulations, participating in mentoring, and being regularly observed by those who can monitor skills and provide feedback to ensure that a quality level of educational interpreting services are being provided and maintained. Understand that these professional standards cannot be directly enforced by NAIE, as each state has the autonomy to develop their own regulations and licensing requirements. We can only strongly suggest that these standard qualifications are adopted by the states to ensure consistency for all students using educational interpreting services. Section 2 of the guidelines is the scope of professional practice. And this section has 3 components. The first of those is professional and ethical practice. All sign language interpreters are obligated to follow the Code of Professional Conduct, or CPC, put forth by the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID. But sign language interpreters working in educational settings are also obligated to follow additional guidance, such as the guidelines put forth by the EIPA or district-specific policies and procedures for educational interpreters. So that component addresses how educational interpreters can follow multiple sets of guidelines simultaneously. The second component is confidentiality. Again, all sign language interpreters are obligated to keep information confidential that is part of the interpreting process. However, interpreters working in educational settings are designated as mandated reporters, meaning they must report information about confirmed or suspected child abuse. Additionally, as members of the educational team, educational interpreters are obligated and encouraged to share pertinent information in those team meetings for the goal of improving the educational programming and outcomes for the student. The third component addresses using the appropriate language and modality. This is a well-known expectation of sign language interpreters. They match the language most readily used and understood by their client. However, for deaf and hard of hearing students, it is also required that this language be documented in their IEP. Often what happens is the language documented in the IEP that's assumed to be used by the student doesn't actually match what the interpreter is seeing. So this section addresses what can be done in that situation. Section 3, roles and responsibilities. For a long time, our field has agreed that there are significant differences between interpreting in the community and interpreting in educational settings. But what exactly those differences are remains up for discussion. There are so many different perspectives, and we took some time to really delve deeply into those, to do some research and develop a list of potentially appropriate roles and responsibilities for educational interpreters. We really emphasize the nature of these being potentially appropriate because educational interpreters are prescribed by IDEA, the law. And the essence of that law is individualized education. Therefore, each student has very different needs that the educational interpreter, along with other team members, are required to meet in different ways. At the same time, there is a boundary for educational interpreters to remain within their scope of practice. So the list includes some roles and responsibilities that could be fulfilled by the educational interpreter, depending on the nature of the situation. Section 4, interpreting related considerations. This section focuses on some topics specific to the interpreting process. The first one being assessments. It is really important for the educational interpreter to understand the goal of each assessment. Sometimes when we interpret from English to ASL, concepts become more clear. So the student might understand the concept presented in ASL, but not necessarily the English word. So it's really important that the educational interpreter work with the teacher and other team members to make sure that each assessment is interpreted in a way that is clear and accessible, but also doesn't skew the results. The second topic is extracurricular activities, like your sports, games, and clubs. Of course, it is within the educational interpreter's role to help provide access to these types of activities, but this topic addresses some other considerations like appropriate compensation. The third topic is related to sensitive situations. For example, if you have an interpreter working with a student all day, and that student needs to see a counselor, it may be appropriate to swap out interpreters for that situation and bring in a different interpreter for the counseling session. But that depends. It might also be most appropriate to make sure that interpreter who's with him every day is also with him in the counseling session. Other examples are medical and legal situations that come up during the school day. Should the interpreter go ahead and interpret those, or should they call for a specialized interpreter who can come in and help with those kinds of situations? Section 5, preparation and provisions. Preparation refers to what the interpreter needs to do before they can enter the classroom ready to interpret. Provisions refers to what the interpreter needs to get, what needs to be provided before they can enter the classroom ready to interpret. For example, as far as preparation, what does the interpreter do? They contact the teacher for a discussion, a meeting, just an email back and forth? How do they plan? For example, for provision, what exactly does the interpreter need? Is it time to do that preparation? Is it a team for a long duration of a meeting? What about the environment? What should the interpreter be provided? A comfortable chair for adults, not a little one for a kindergartner. These kinds of things are examples, but there are many. Section 6, considerations for hiring, placement, and promotion. The overarching goal of this section is to make sure that we are bringing in and placing interpreters who are qualified to provide optimal, clear interpreting services. So understand that this section does not say interpreters must have these specific qualifications for these specific situations. Rather, it offers guidance for school districts to figure out how to develop their own appropriate job descriptions and salaries. Next, we want to discuss what is not currently addressed in the guidelines. Deaf interpreters. Currently, there is not enough documented evidence on standard practices for deaf interpreters working in K-12 settings. However, the guidelines do emphasize the use of native language models and deaf educational professionals to facilitate language and exposure to ASL. We also recognize that there is a lack of testing and certification available for deaf interpreters. Another topic not addressed is deafblind students and interveners. The role of an intervener expands beyond an educational interpreter's role. An intervener's scope of work is different from the traditional educational interpreter. However, there are other organizations with expertise and knowledge in this area who inform us of what those roles look like. So those are two important topics that are not addressed yet in our guidelines. So what's next? At the beginning of this presentation, we talked about how the standards and requirements still vary state by state for educational interpreters. Now, we want to continue disseminating the guidelines to model standards and minimum qualifications for educational interpreters. Please share these guidelines with administrators, state leaders, and school districts. NAIE also has several strategic goals we are working towards. One of those is the development of a code of ethics for educational interpreters, along with investigating what a standardized certification could look like. We sincerely hope you will help us spread awareness on the guidelines to ultimately raise the standards and quality of sign language interpreters in education. It's important to acknowledge that we have just barely scratched the surface in this presentation. However, you can download a complete copy of the guidelines for free from our website, which is www.naiedu.org/guidelines. We also hope you'll consider joining as a member of NAIE. We are currently offering a 1-year free membership. Anyone can join, whether you are an educational interpreter, teacher of the deaf, or other professional. More information about that can be found on our website as well. Thank you for your time and attention today. If you have any questions, please contact us through email at info@naiedu.org. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.